Good. Hello, good evening. How are you? My name is Joey Quinones, and I'm the head of the fiber department here at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Tamara Kostianovsky. And I have this bio that she thought was too long, and I think you should share all the wonderful things that you do every opportunity. So. Argentine-American artist Tamara Kostianovsky's work addresses the environment, violence, and consumer culture, often employing discarded clothing to create visceral and intricate sculptures and installations. She has presented solo exhibitions at the Musée de la Chasse et de la Nature, Paris, France, the Baker Museum, Denver Botanic Gardens, Smack Mellon, Fuller Craft Museum, Slag Gallery, RX Gallery in Paris, Ogden Contemporary Arts, and many other venues. Her work has been exhibited in several group exhibitions at museums such as the Royal Academy of Arts, Brooklyn Museum, El Museo del Barrio, the Jewish Museum, Nevada Museum of Art, Musée du Textile et de la Mode in France, and the Children's Museum of Manhattan. She's also the recipient of distinguished awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts, Pollock Krasner Foundation, Groot Foundation, and others. Her work has been reviewed in the New York Times, Art in America, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe, Village Voice, El Diario, Colossal, and Hyperallergic. Selected residencies, I want all my students to take notes. Selected residencies include Yaddo, Lair Arts, Wave Hill Gardens, Cheekwood Estate and Gardens, Socrates Sculpture Park, and Franconia Sculpture Park. Kostianovsky received a BFA from the National School of Fine Arts in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and an MFA from Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, Philadelphia. So please join me in welcoming Tamara Kostianovsky.
Good evening. Thank you, Joey, for that introduction and for inviting me here. And thank you to Cranbrook and all the students and the warm welcome I've received so far. I'm excited to be here. It's a school I knew of from when I was choosing to do an MFA. It was a little bit too close to the North Pole at the time for my standards, but I'm very happy to be here, and I think I missed out on incredible resources by not coming here. But I'm going to show you some slides. It's basically about 15, 20 years of artwork. And I like to say that the first two slides that I will share with you are a little bit on the graphic side. So if you don't like to see blood or if you're sensitive to those types of imagery, perhaps you want to look away for a few seconds, and then the rest will be just artwork and nothing to worry about. Perhaps the beginning is a juxtaposition of two major paths in my life. One is that my father was a surgeon, and I grew up surrounded by photos like this. He was very adamant in documenting his operations, and photographs of before and after, burned wounds, grafting techniques, plastic surgery. All of that was sort of on rotation at the dining table. And later on, when I was younger and a BFA student, I started sort of interning at my father's office. I was just opening the door and serving coffee and just there, really. But I really got an opportunity to see a world underneath the skin, which completely fascinated me and stayed with me to this day. It was an important time in my life because I was seeing these images, and then the day ended, and then I would walk to my art school, which was a few blocks away, and I would have painting class. So when I was sort of mixing colors in oil, I wasn't just thinking of, the pigments and, yellow wasn't the color of the sun. Yellow was the color of the fat I had seen around the eyes of a patient. On the other hand, I grew up in Argentina. Argentina has, if you don't know this, a very big meat industry, and we think of our beef as a national pride. And images of carcasses like this are really ubiquitous, especially in the 70s and early 80s, which is at the time I was growing up there. I often say that it's almost analogous to the beer truck in the United States, that you see one in every corner delivering beer at every deli. At least that's the way it's in New York. In Buenos Aires, you would see one meat truck in every corner. So I moved to the United States, and I went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which was a very fruitful time of self-discovery and trying to craft a type of language for myself. And then eventually moved to New York, where I started to make sculpture. So it was a couple of years after my graduation that I made the first carcass works. These were life-sized, and these are three pretty much identical sides of beef that I made using my own clothing. The connection to the clothing has almost like an anecdotal nature to it. I moved to the United States in the year 2000, and in 2001, Argentina had a big default of its economy. So overnight, the money that I had coming from home to pay for my life in the US was non-existent. And I was in grad school and absolutely had no money to go buy art supplies. So I started working with my clothes. I had brought a lot of sweaters in fear of the winter. As you can see, this is a recurrent theme in my life. And within a few months, actually, I had shrunken them in the dryers, because we tend to air dry our clothes in South America. The weather is like much milder, and I wasn't familiar with how to use a dryer. So within 3 or 4 months, I had a nice collection of size 0 sweaters that didn't fit anyone. But they were freshly laundered, and because of really economical need, I started to look at them as potential materials to make art. After a while, the image of the carcass kind of came out, and that was something that kind of stayed with me and never really left. I started making more of these carcass works. I was using towels, I was using my clothing, I was using curtains, and all of these trying to render at the time in a naturalistic way these images of beef I had seen while growing up. I can say that there was something about, at the time, people started to say that I was making soft sculpture, and I think this came up in one of the crits today with the students. I never really identify with that term. I never felt that my work was soft, and I actually didn't like that idea. So I purposely contrasted the softness of the fabric with hardware that denoted kind of a masculine, industrial, really harsh impression. So it was finding a balance between the knits and the lace and all this feminine clothing against the harshness of the metal that to me became more and more important as time went by. These are all not one-on-one scale. The work does not work when it's smaller. There's something about the scale, and also there's something that I started to realize having to do with the quantity. It wasn't enough to make one or two. I almost wanted to be surrounded, embedded by these images of carcasses. When I think of them, there's many things. I'm not just talking about the Argentinian meat industry. I'm also talking about violence to the body, violence to the human body, violence to the animal body, which happens to have a very similar shape and composition. And in particular, I think I'm also talking about violence to the female body. these are all made with my own clothes. Up to this time, like all of this was directly cannibalized from my wardrobe. And in the year 2004, my maternal grandmother was murdered in Argentina. This is 3 years before I started making the carcasses. So in a way, I felt that this was a way of speaking of those femicides, not directly with a human form, but at times thinking of how humans are killed like animals and in very inhumane ways. And there was something that also had to do with myself. How do I put myself into this picture of the body dismembered, the body violated, which to many to these days continues to be very gory and very brutal and visceral, but to me, I hope that you also see the beauty of that. I have a strong memory of going to school by myself with my little brother, one of the first times that my parents let me walk alone, and seeing a meat truck at a street corner, and it was kind of the first time that I really saw that with an awareness of what I was looking at, and it really felt as I was looking into the world of the adults, a world that I had not seen before. There was something forbidden about it, and yet it was extremely attractive from a formal perspective. The colors, the pinks, the reds, the whites, I never really got over that. So over time, the carcasses, this is one of the tallest carcasses. I think it's about 10 feet tall, so that you have an idea. And you can perhaps, I don't know if I have a pointer there. Yeah, perhaps you can see this is like a Nike sock. There's recognizable items in all of these works. Over time, I think that living in New York, working in the 2000s, in the last decade, the idea of ecology and the urgency of the climate crisis really embedded my work and prompted me to think of not carcasses not just as spaces of carnage, but potentially as a site for regeneration and a type of botanical regeneration. The carcasses that you're looking at in this slide are all flowery. I call them the flowery carcasses, and they use upholstery fabrics. They have birds growing out of them, vegetation that is, for the most part, quite tropical. And I perhaps should make the distinction that I became attracted to this type of vegetation because in New York, my community of artists is Latin American artists and Caribbean artists. We're all under one umbrella. I think that language binds us in that way, and labeling in the States is a big deal. And it was through my Puerto Rican and Guatemalan and Dominican friends that I really became aware of the power of the vegetation in the tropics, which is not exactly what happens in Argentina, which is much south in the South American continent. This installation that you're seeing, it's 5 carcasses on a ceiling-mounted moving truck. The carcasses are, the installation is kinetic, and the carcasses move around the space at a very slow speed. But there's something in which, to me, in this work, I'm able to blend in many of the topics that I've been talking to you about, and also the world of fashion and the fashion industry and how textiles become such a pollutant. To me, when the carcasses turn around, there's something reminiscent of the fashion shows, the runway with the models sort of circulating and going around. So to me, this work is sort of bringing those two universes together. Of course, working with discarded clothing as I do today, I became very aware of the politics of that. I must say that my sweaters, before I started using them in my work, I tried to sell them, donate them. I, find some use for it before I realized that nobody really wanted them in the United States, which is very stark difference with what would happen in South America with articles of clothing even if it's small, but there's always somebody who needs them. There's a type of need that we don't see in the United States. And I think that was also something that to me was important. You're seeing here another view of this installation. It's called Mesmerizing Flesh. I made it in Ogden, I worked with this idea of movement in my work before. Initially, each carcass was mounted to one individual motor and would spin in place. And it took me about, I would say, 7 years until I found the right venue that wanted to produce this work in the way that I wanted to do it. And to me, that was also a big lesson, that sometimes you have a big idea and there's something you want to make and you can't, and it's very frustrating. But it just takes time. And I like the idea of building works in stages. So the individual motor kind of led to this orchestration of the grouping, and that took time. It wasn't easy to find this venue, and sometimes you need to find somebody who's a dreamer like you and has the ability to make things happen. I was lucky with this venue in Utah, of all places, but the exhibition was successful, and I'm thrilled. And to this day, I have plans to show it once again. This was an exhibit that took place in 2021. Going back to the carcasses without flowers, I'm excited to show you this large whale, also life-size, that I made at Socrates Sculpture Park, which is a sculpture park in New York, in Queens, Astoria, which invites emerging artists to make large sculpture in the public realm, usually for the first time. So this was the time that I made my piece at the park. It's built with a structure of wood. It's 2x4s and plywood, and then there's metal mesh that sort of is stapled onto the structure, and then there's a layer of I forget the name of this, but this material is not batting, it's what you put under carpets to make them like squishy, and then it's covered in vinyl. So you probably already got a little bit of this. I come to my work with heavy feelings, I'm talking about, a murder in my family. I'm talking about the dictatorship and, like all these images that kind of I grew up around. And yet when I presented this piece, to my surprise, everybody thought it was like the most fun thing in the world to jump around. It was a total success among the kids in Queens. I was not prepared for that, neither was the piece, so there was a lot of maintenance involved. If you can imagine about 100 little children jumping on it and using it as a slide on a daily basis. But that was sort of also a lesson in how your work can be, once you put it out there, is perceived perhaps differently from what you intended. And actually, I'm excited that happened now that I recover from all the maintenance, because I put out something sad and people kind of turn it around into something happy, and people interacted with the torn body, and it wasn't a dreadful experience. It was, on the contrary, something that brought people together. So you can see here some close-ups of how I work with the vinyl. I sculpted it. It was soft. I actually screwed the vinyl onto the wooden structure, so that's how it's attached. And that was what it took. The piece was supposed to stay on view for a year, and it did. It went through the winter, and then it was unfortunately destroyed. Around the time I met with a friend who told me, like, perhaps you want to investigate the idea of switching to another species, like enough with the cows, like perhaps you want to look at birds or something else. And I thought it was a good idea. And I ordered on eBay some feathers that I would use to see if I could replicate them in fabric. That was sort of my goal. So I was a young mom. I had a baby in the house. I was sort of making dinner and ordering something online. And I ordered these feathers, and to my surprise, within a few days, I didn't receive a manila envelope as I expected, but instead a pretty large box that had a weight to it. So I sensed that something was not exactly what I intended, and I took the box to my studio. Eventually, I had the courage to open it, and this is what I found inside. Like they sent me a recently killed pheasant in the mail. I guess I was shopping for feathers for taxidermy, and they thought this would make it. I was very shocked to receive this because I had seen, live bodies in operations, and I have seen a million photographs of cows, from which I worked, but I had never really been in direct contact with like a dead body. And and birds have this wonderful thing that they have this iridescence to their feathers. There's this delicacy, but at the same time, this was kind of a pretty strong image to have on my working table. If you can relate, if you have a studio practice and you have a table, imagine opening a box and finding this. So after a while, I took the bird by its legs and I hung it in one of my meat hooks, the ones I had from before. And the bird kind of opened up its wings in a manner that to me was very reminiscent of all the images of Jesus I had seen growing up. I grew up in a Jewish family, but in a very Catholic country, and these images of Christ on the cross were really everywhere. So I kind of soon became mesmerized by all of these things together, and I started making dead birds in fabric. The dead birds offered me the possibility to work with other types of fabrics, not just my own, but discarded upholstery fabrics, remnants of people making curtains that, leftovers, and they would sell them online. It was a type of collaging in 3 dimensions. There was more variation in the palette, in the textures, and I also continued in this path for a while. I have to say that neither the birds nor the cows are something that I completely exorcise. I feel that these are not images that I have exhausted, and I come back to them all the time. The birds were many as well. This is an exhibition at a gallery in New York at the time, where I had them suspended and from different heights, it opened up all kinds of avenues for making birds. And again, I was smitten by the image of the dead bird, and to this day, telling you about it, I'm still shaken. So it was a way of honoring this bird. I also want to tell you that that day, so I was trying to get feathers to see if I could replicate them in fabric, as I said, and I tried to pluck the feathers out of the pheasant, and it was very difficult. Apparently there's a technique that I'm not aware with what it was. So within like a few minutes, I really had like a scene of carnage in my studio, and there was blood everywhere. And so I took the bird home and I cooked it for dinner. I thought that was sort of the least I could have done for this bird whose death I ordered by clicking purchase, so inadvertently what I was shopping online. The birds took many iterations. This is one of them. This is at the UICA, we were just talking about that, in Grand Rapids. And perhaps one of the most successful presentations of these birds was this one that was a recent exhibition at the Musée de la Chasse et de la Nature in Paris, a museum that is the Museum of Hunting and Nature, in which all the collection in the museum is really referencing images of hunting. Hunting traditionally in Europe was reserved for the aristocracy, who could take the pleasures of going around in their own estates. So museums and wealth and paintings of hunts, they're all interrelated. So my works work really well in there. This was a 3-floor takeover of the museum in which my works were placed next to the collection. This is the room of the birds. And my bird is, you don't see it there, but it's on a single motor, and it's also turning around in the space. Talking about my friends from the Caribbean, I became interested in the material culture of the colonial era. Colonial practices and colonial history has been a topic of great discussion recently, with a lot of fundament to it. So I kind of soon realized that there was a brand of a company that made wall coverings. And this company is called Zuber and Company, and perhaps any of you would want to look up or are familiar with it. It's the company that designs wallpapers. If you think of the Oval Office, and there's a wallpaper, a historical wallpaper of George Washington, and it was created by this company. So they have a line that is related to birds on the tropics. And something I've noticed was that they took, in order to make these wallpapers, they sent out traveling artists from France through the Americas to draw the landscape, which they would bring back in designs that would be adapted for wallpaper. In these very interesting and lush designs, there's kind of a big mistake, and the mistake is that the birds that they put in are birds of Southeast Asia. A lot of peacocks appear in those wallpapers, whereas we have no peacocks in the Americas, so they're not native. And it was sort of an attempt to really exoticize the landscape, and it was a time in which they were promoting the Americas as a place to go to. So what I did with this series was really copy the background designs from Zuber, and when I say copy, I pretty much cover in fabric the designs that they have, that I actually print and glue onto my panels. But then replaced the birds not with peacocks, but with birds native to the Americas. So that's what this series is doing, and in a way, sort of like telling the story from two opposing sides, the colonizers and the colonized, and sort of what price ecology paid in the colonization, or how it got richer. But if we think of the movement of species and not just goods and people, but also animals, like there was a big movement of landscapes that happened in that journey as well. So I made several of these panels. This is the only one in which there's like an actual bird feather in there. For the most part, it's all fabric. And the peaks I make using, at the time, I don't make them that way anymore, but that beak was made using acrylic nails that were covered in resin. And I still, to this day, I'm very drawn to materials that I find in the home. Just things related to sort of the female body, my clothes, nails, etc. This piece is about 4 by 8 feet, and is one in which there's, a cut on the panel, and working as a sculptor, very interested in organic forms. Like sometimes the rectangular nature of the panel gets on my nerves, and I cut it out and I try to break it up. And just of these panels, I wanted to show you an example of a piece that was commissioned for the Miami port, and this is just opening in December, in which you see one of these a triptych of these panels I've been showing you. The detail on the right is of the central panel, and I'm showing you these just to tell you that textile art is slowly conquering also the realm of public art, and this is exciting because for the longest time, public art meant marble or bronze or murals, and I think that because there's so many people working in fibers today, people are opening their doors timidly, but surely. I have a few more images of the flowery carcasses. I call this piece the blondes. It's sort of like two women with blonde hair. I strongly identify with a figure, with a female figure, and to a certain degree with a type of self-portraiture in these sculptures. There's something, as I said, feminine about them. Is my clothing, is the pinks and the reds are there. And on the other hand, all these other stories that I've been saying related to regeneration, Renaissance, and carnage. The works are sculptures in the round. I'm very happy to be invited to the fibers department, but I think of myself as a sculptor who works with fabric more than a textile artist, although I don't know what sculpture or it doesn't matter. The categories are obsolete at this point, but these are sculptures in the round. They are meant to be seen from all points of view, and they are, on a scale one-on-one with reality. I want this to be part of our world. I want the viewer to relate to these works with his or her physicality, and to me, it's important that they really occupy space in our world. This is a view of my studio. At the time I was working, I don't know if you can see that there, but on a maquette for an exhibition at Smack Mellon, a venue in New York. And that's something that I always do, which is to really plan out a three-dimensional space, especially when the exhibition is ambitious. Usually there's not a lot of time for installation. I don't like the surprises, and I learned from my mistakes of not planning ahead. So now before an exhibit, I have things planned out, and I have works made to the scale of the model so that I can see how they would work. In 2017, I was invited to be an artist in residence at Wave Hill Gardens. This is a botanic garden in the Bronx in New York. And the premise of the residency is to make something that's related to nature, and particular to their grounds, and it's almost like a living museum of wonderful trees, in which each wonderful tree has a specimen on display. So I applied, and this was at the time in which my father had passed away. So my project for Wave Hill was to create a series of carcasses of trees using my father's clothing. So most of what you see here, particularly in the bark of the tree, is my father's signature corduroy pants and other types of garments. So these are all, it's wood, it's plywood, it's similarly built as the whale I mentioned before. They're hollow inside, and they have this mechanical cut that to me is really important. This is not trees that have been cut out in a storm. This is the action of men, like killing this tree or doing this drastic action. These are also life-size, and again, you can see how this wouldn't work if it was any smaller. And this is a view of the work in my studio and how it's done with stripes of fabric that I cut out and I glue onto plywood or a structure that I made in wood. This is a view, and you can see two works in scale at the Botanical Gardens in Denver, where the sculptures were presented by the curator's choice on a platform, and this is something that I'm experiencing as I'm making the work, and the works travel from one venue to another. Curators have their own take, and some venues require a platform, some venues want to put them on the floor, and it's also the works change with the context, and I think that's actually an interesting thing. This is one of the latest carcasses that I made. It's called Sunset, and it has the colors of a sunset, of course. But when I make these trees, I actually still think of the inside of the body. I still think of flesh. I still think of fat and muscle and cartilage and all of these, almost as if when you cut a tree, you would see a similar palette as you would see in making a cut onto a human body. The photo that you're looking at is from a residency program in Paris that's called Lair Arts, and the space is actually the space that was used by Soutine and Modigliani, which is still an active artist studio, and you guys can apply. So you see that the space is not in great shape at the moment. They're fundraising to remodel it, but there was something really interesting happening with that back wall in there that was literally humid. You would touch it and it was wet. So that piece kind of inspired me to make those mushrooms onto the tree slice that's on the wall. It's called Champignon de Paris, mushrooms of Paris. And what you're seeing here is my residency was, I took it to create work for the exhibition at the Musée de la Chasse, more so to assemble work that would go to that exhibit. It was too big to ship, too pricey, so things were shipped. The faces of the artwork I made in New York, so if you can think of the planes, the plywood planes, and then what I did in Paris was assemble them together. You see a close-up, a little out of focus, apologies, of the mushrooms. And this is what the tree trunk looks like all together when assembled. Is, I don't know, big, almost as big as the whale. And in this case, it was presented at the Musée de la Chasse, but I actually prefer this presentation, which was at the gallery in Paris, because it's in a really wide space and you can see the volumes. The volumes that, traditionally when I was a student, I would look up the works of Donald Judd and these other artists who had made these modernist sculptures that were very shape-based and very strong. I also kind of wanted to respond to that with fabric. I wanted to have that type of gravitas with my work in a white space. That you can see some of the faces, how they're done in layers. And by the way, in order to make these trees, I don't just make it all up. I actually, first of all, I take a lot of photos of trees, dead trees that I encounter everywhere. And also, for example, in order to create this pattern onto this tree, I would take photos of an actual tree that's like this, and then print it and glue it onto a plywood sheet and then trace it with fabric. So I'm actually, there's photography involved here and there's a lot of research. I rarely make up my own patterns. My own patterns are actually quite boring. Like nature has always more exciting things up the sleeve. This is the other side of the sculpture. I also have to say that the whale and this piece have a very similar type of construction, these being some of the largest works I made, and they are created in sections, right? They're not, there's not one thing. I've I'm an artist. I've been in Brooklyn for 20 years. Studio space is always a problem. It's either not permanent enough or not clean enough or doesn't have heat or doesn't have a bathroom or usually it's not large enough. So this idea of working in works that can be put together on site, can be assembled, allows me to expand when the opportunity arises and then to bring things back when the show ends. The piece I'm showing you here was a recent installation that took place in Nashville, Tennessee, at Chickwood. Chickwood is also a botanical garden, and by the way, I've been kind of working this circle of the botanic gardens that have a connection with art, and they invite artists to do works in their galleries that respond to the surroundings. For this, I wanted to make a tree stamp, but this time I wanted to put more effort on the tree roots. I wanted the tree roots to be all-encompassing and to really take on a more installation like presence. So I created these by using a CNC cutout of wood, and then once I had those pieces of plywood that were cut out, on site we stapled the fabric onto the plywood. So the piece has been recently shown at another venue, and it's coming to my studio in a few weeks, and it will come in separate pieces of plywood that hopefully I'll be able to put next to each other. I have to say that the gallery where I was showing wasn't very big. You're actually seeing it all in there. And when I was working on it, I became interested in, there were happy accidents that happened. I like the back, I like the side, I like, or we would put a lot of effort into an actual part of the tree that wouldn't be seen from the trajectory that we had delineated. So the mylar in the back really was there to overcome that challenge, to show the viewer sort of what was behind. And I'm gonna go back here. So you can see that you have a full experience of the piece in 3D, in 360. And also the half circle that you see it's transformed into a full circle, right? So you can even see yourself in the work, and it's another way of expanding the size of an installation. This is a recent shot of my studio in Brooklyn, the one that's not big enough. And you can see 2 works in process and boxes of discarded items and other things. These were 2 sculptures I made in preparation for the current exhibit that is up in New York at this time at SLAG and RX Gallery. And what I wanted to do with these 2 works, and I will show you in a minute, was to create a type of integration of the tree and the carcass, almost as if a tree could grow a carcass, or if a carcass would be transformed into a tree, that moment of metamorphosis. And when I was in grad school, I became obsessed with this sculpture of Bernini of Apollo and Daphne, and perhaps some of you are familiar with it, in which Daphne is kind of literally transforming into a laurel tree. So this idea of the figure transforming into a tree has been with me for a long time, and I wanted to capture that moment of transformation. This is one of the sculptures at SLAG. It's one of I think the only carcass that it's double like that, and with 2 pieces that really meet at the neck. So there's like a lot of space in between. The piece is called Finding Space. And the areas that would be the most gruesome in the carcass, the viscerae, and like everything that would be hanging on this side, is replaced with that very ornate wallpaper design that I mentioned before. This is what the piece looks like. It's entitled Colossus. It's tall. It's I think 13 feet tall, something like that. And the idea of the roots already kind of growing and expanding. This is the view of the current show. So I'm showing the piece that I made in Nashville for the second time. I thought I would never show it again, but then when this exhibition was coming together, I wanted to perhaps put some, I wanted the idea that there would be suspended works, there would be works that had a foot to it, and works that operated on the floor, and that to work on different levels, not just all on the floor or all on the wall or all suspended, but to kind of work with the viewer on that idea. Another view of the current exhibition as well. And now I have 2 more slides. So I'm right now working on exhibition plans for a venue in New Jersey for an exhibition that opens in 2026. And these past few days, I've been working with a curator in a layout, and 6 months before the show, things are starting to heat up. What I'm showing you here is a proposal for my exhibition. This is a rendering. This hasn't happened yet. But the idea here would be to create 3 floor sculptures like the ones I just showed you, that would have a root system that would be reminiscent of like lily pads and those kind of floating structures that are mesmerizing to me. This would be together with the moving track that I showed you before, that I showed a few years ago and not since. And the exciting part to this is that we are trying to see if we can put motor under this so that the lily pads are turning in space, right? So you would get into a space in which you have this movement of the large sculptures rotating onto themselves and the moving track as well. So like very kinetic, very in your face. And here is a maquette that I didn't finish, but I still wanted to include it here, of how the space would work, right? And the sculptures that you see on the right are the ones that I actually reuse them all the time for my maquettes. I have a box of carcasses in scale, and I reconfigure them. So imagine that the ones that are on the floor would be on this in the moving rack, and then there would be the 3 large lily pads moving as well. So those are the plans for June of 2026. I think that's my last slide. I'm 8 minutes too early. I talk too fast. So thank you. Thank you.
All right. So we have time for questions, and just please wait for the microphone.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, there it is. I was hoping you could speak to storage of your sculptures. I know this is a practical question and maybe not the most interesting, but to break the ice for questions.
Yeah, that's an important question. Storage is a problem. I wish I was a painter. Storage is always a problem. Luckily, my gallery in Paris has a lot of storage there. So all the works that are in Europe, I don't have to worry about. I have to worry about the ones that are here. I went from renting storage space to having things in my studio. I recently, literally 2 weeks ago, rented an additional room in the building where I have my studio to kind of have it all together, because the works, when they are in storage, they're pretty much inaccessible, because anybody who had a storage unit probably would know how awful it is to go there. It's a pretty traumatizing experience, and especially to bring something from the back to the front. And I wanted to have the ability to be able to bring work back and forth and see it. So it's a constant battle, and I cannot say that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about moving to places like Ann Arbor or Pennsylvania or Uruguay, or it's something that burdens me a lot because the work is getting bigger, and I don't think it's my job to make it small to fit my storage needs. I think that I have to find a way to store it. I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm excited to have a room in my studio building now where it's mostly storage, and I separated so that this new room has storage and a computer, an office, and a printer. So I was able to separate the wood and the fibers from the computer. And I'm also, I don't have this to show you here, but I also built a rack for the sculptures for the first time, because it's really the first time that I have storage that I can access easily. So I built an actual rack to hang all the works, because they were always in boxes and one on top of the other. Now they're all suspended inside one open crate, if you want, and I think that's good for the work. So it may also provide me with another exhibition idea for display for these works.
Hello. Hi. I guess this is also sort of a practical question, but with the meat hooks you utilize and like the rotating apparatus and stuff, do you have a special wholesaler or like a person you go to, or do you get them secondhand, or are you interested in antique ways of stringing things up and stuff like that?
Sorry, I missed the word. If I have a what?
Like a specific source that you go to get
sure.
your meat hooks or
Sure, yeah. I do. I'm still a faithful customer to eBay, despite the bird incident. I find a lot of the hooks on eBay. I'm always bidding on hooks. It's sort of a hobby, shopping therapy, and the meat hooks that are, so some are these actual ones that people used, and some I have fabricated. The ones that have a plate that go on the wall, those are I work with several metal fabricators in different parts of the country to build those. And the moving track, for example, the larger installation was built by a company that specializes in moving tracks for meat places, and the venue in Utah kind of funded that production. And I got to keep this amazing piece with a motor that is bigger than this auditorium. But I can show it again.
Cool. Thank you.
Anybody? I think I got it? Okay. This is kind of another practical question. You talked about working with fabricators for the metal pieces. I'm wondering if you also work with fabricators for the wooden structures that you're building on top of. And this is kind of a two-part, because also, do you use wooden structures for the hanging pieces, or are those all fabric and kind of the process of making those?
Great questions. The carcasses that have, I'm gonna go back here. This type of flat surface inside, which are many of them have that, not all, is plywood that I incorporate onto. I almost kind of make a plywood panel that has all this technique, and then I build a carcass around it. The other carcasses, such as the one that's on the screen right now, do not have plywood. It's just a chicken wire, batting, and a layer of fabric at the top. The works are actually fairly light because they're hollow. And in regards to the carpentry question, it is my dream to find a fabricator who would build these structures for me, because I do not enjoy making them. But I do, because they are too expensive. And, ask around, and I recently, for example, for the piece that I showed at Chickwood with the root system, I started working with a fabricator who said, "I'm going to make it out of styrofoam," and and it was not going in the right direction, and it was too expensive, and often the budget doesn't really allow for fabricator services. So we make them in-house. I work with 2 assistants and an intern. It takes me a long time, and I would say that for the works that have wood in them, especially the trees, 75% of my time is on the wooden structure. Perhaps because I'm not the greatest carpenter and I don't know how to do it, just so easily and gracefully. Getting to the fabric part is a joy and is the easy part, but getting the form right. And the form right, and I mean in carpentry, and I also mean with chicken wire, if the form isn't right, no matter what I do with fabric, it's not going to work. And this is, again, where I go to this concept that I'm a sculptor who works with textiles. If it was bronze, if it was marble, if it was clay, I'm bound by the same laws of visual arts and sculpture as Michelangelo and all these other sculptures that came before me. And I also feel in the question, and I'm sort of like sidetracking a little bit, but on this question of the tradition, because I think that's also something that is important for artists to kind of know where you are, who came before you, what's the tradition are you following. And I feel that I follow in a tradition of artists that have been interested in flesh, and that goes from Soutine to Rembrandt to Francis Bacon. There's a lot of people who have been really trying to render flesh with oil for the most part, but also with marble and as Michelangelo, for example. So there's a lot of precedent for that, and I feel, and that feeling that I'm to a certain degree a link on a larger chain, that's reassuring at times in which I am working, and the work is confrontational to this day, even with the flowers. There's a lot of people who have a strong reaction to it. So I think it's important to know who your sources are and in what family you're in, and just to keep going.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I was interested in hearing about the sort of connection with your late father and how that was sort of a jumping off point for some of your inspiration in your work. I guess I was just curious if, what his sort of reaction was, and if he was, interested in almost his life's work being kind of displayed in a different way, through art, and if that was a big point of connection for you too.
Right. He was very proud and very encouraging, and the one person in the family who really supported me in my work. Then came the trees with his clothing, so in a way, my father's presence is still with us. He would be delighted that we're talking about him tonight. And it's really, working with fabric. And, this is sort of the part that gets me with, it's not just fabric, but it's recycled clothing. And when I work with, some of my dad's clothes, to a certain degree, this clothing has his dead cells in him. People often ask me if I wash the clothes before using them. And when it's my clothes, yes. But I didn't wash my father's clothing. So to a certain degree, there's almost you're working with a material that has a lot of charge, that almost as the skin is in the fabric, it's sort of like a second skin. It's like a body. So I don't come to the world of fiber from crafts or from fashion. I really come from surgery, So when I am handling material, when I'm thinking of doing something with fabric, I'm thinking of flesh. So that would be there. I don't know if I went in there, if I responded.
To follow up on what you said, and you've mentioned several times that you identify as a sculptor, yet you work with textile, fiber. You comment on sources or motivations, or let's say the reasoning behind your work, which is the female body, which is poverty, immigration. So those subjects, I think, mean something totally different when you identify as a fiber artist than a sculptor. At least sort of for me it is important to claim to be a fiber artist. It's very different than having it under the large umbrella of being a sculptor. What makes you say that you are a sculptor?
That I work in 3 dimensions. That the work is very three-dimensional. I think that's an excellent question. And I met with a few students today, and I was encouraging everybody to make fabric come into the space. I think that what I'm less interested in is in fabric that's on the wall, that like the tapestry or the more traditional type of quilt or thing. I think that is the three-dimensionality and this idea that you're making a body, so to speak, that has a presence in the real world, in our three-dimensional world. That, to me, is the distinction. And there's also, on a side note, when I was younger, I remember having a visit with a hotshot gallerist at the time who was advising me on career. And he looked at my resume and he said, everything that has the word craft, fiber, in your resume, delete it now, because nobody will take you seriously as an artist if you have those words in there. That's a strong, today, probably to many of you who are young and we're in a post-label world in the arts, that wasn't that long ago. That was 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And I think in 10 years, fibers have conquered the mainstream. What I would want to see still is more people working three-dimensionally with fabric. And perhaps it's a personal preference, but I find it more exciting when it's in space.
Just one more question.
Hi. Thank you for the sharing. I was really interested in, I wrote here, beef, cow, carcass, to bird, to tree, mushroom, to roots, and then going back to the body again as a whole. And then you mentioned a few times that you make a lot of new work at galleries or residencies. I'm interested in when you do that, do you kind of let the encounter, the bird was the encounter, do you let the encounter of the residency or gallery to have new ideas, or you plan before you go, okay, I'm going to make with a new direction of trees, or you kind of just let the new idea hit you? That's what I'm interested in.
It's a really good question. Residencies, even commissions, chance encounters, they really shape you. as an artist. For example, this tree idea. If I'm going to tell you the full story, this is a very competitive place to apply. I applied 1,000 times. I never got in. And at some point, I kind of realized that in most of the artists that they accepted, there was a more, perhaps, friendly attitude to nature, right? Like when they meant representations of nature, they didn't mean a dead bird with meat, with flesh hanging out. They meant something a little bit more agreeable to their board, to their donors. So that's how the idea of the trees came about. To perhaps they can make a carcass that doesn't have blood, that's a little bit more. And I was trying to get in. It was something exciting at the time. I didn't have a studio. I provided a studio for 5 months. It was an opportunity. So that started a body of work that I continue to this day, and that happened, 7 years ago. So those residencies, those experiences, hopefully even this visit will shape who I am. So I think as an artist it's important to take challenges, to go places, to travel if you can, to get out of your comfort zone, to see other things. And I find most of my inspiration in nature, even if it's with a dead bird that comes via FedEx, it's still nature.
You want to ask a question, Ale? Okay. That's the last question.
Hello, hi. I'm wondering what entering those rooms feels like, because the visuals are very striking, but scent-wise, because you're working with butcher bodies, and when we're passing through the meat aisle in the grocery store or a butcher shop, there's this particular scent, but also flower-wise, some flowers have a sweet fragrance to lure, but also some flowers have a rotten scent to lure different pollinators or different animals. So, because you're building these bodies, I'm wondering what that experience is like, and if you're using scent also as a tool or as a resource. Thank you.
I have not used scent as a resource. I consider it. Thank you for the idea. I feel that I have been trying to incorporate more things that would engage the senses. For example, the idea of the kinetic sculpture, right? So it's not just colorful and super textured and tall and imposing and shocking, but it also moves, And I feel, I was talking to one of you earlier today about the closing ceremony of the Olympics in Paris. I don't know if anybody saw that, but it was sort of a show that had light and movement and music and color and fireworks. So to a certain degree, I feel that the visual competition is very saturated today for the average person. So in a way, I want my works to be to capture more of the senses. And in the sense of, you made me think of, the dead body and flowers. That there's this tradition of bringing flowers to a funeral, putting flowers in there. I actually, after my father's death, I realized that this was to cover the smell of the dead body, right? So there is a correlation between flowers and the dead. So they are I think it's life and death, and it's this pull and push of beauty and repulsion, and operating in that line. That's sort of where I see myself. Thank you.